Welcome back to another SCP Files and Zip podcast. We are back. Wow, it's a miracle. We never shoot these. But I'm back with Keyshawn and Turna.
Hello.
Hello.
You want to introduce yourselves?
You guys know who I am already. I've been on this podcast enough times.
It's really funny how you think we have a consistent watch base who watches these over and over again. Maybe two, maybe three people.
That's fair. Hello, I'm Keyshawn. I'm an animator in my senior year, and I can't wait to start working at this point.
Keyshawn has his own channel where he does some D&D stuff, and he does some animation film reels and stuff, and that will be linked in the description below if you want to check him out.
Hey.
Turnup is, by his more common name, PewDiePie. He has a small channel on YouTube. Clearly. We're trying to get him up, just pushing him fast. You want to add anything, Turnup?
Not really. I'm a player in Keyshawn's campaign, but that's about it.
All right, let's jump right into it. So, today, you guys tell me exactly what SCP we're doing.
What? Oh.
If I had to guess, the flesh that hates, maybe?
That's a great guess, except it's completely wrong. Turnup, you guess.
Well, awesome.
You're right. It is SCP-035.
I have a number in it. Yes.
What on
Keyshawn,
earth?
why can't you be more like Turnup?
Of course.
Hey, I did not come here to be bullied.
We're doing SCP-035, otherwise known as the Possessive Mask. This one's pretty common. It's in SCP Containment Breach. It is one of the few actual characters in the game. And it's a pretty interesting SCP to talk about. It's got a long history with the Foundation, and an even longer history outside of the Foundation. And it can be a character, a monster, or an object, which you find very rarely in the SCP Foundation. Most things in the SCP Foundations fit in one solid context. Dr. Bright is a character. I am struggling to find other examples. The infinite toilet paper is an object. SCP-173 is a monster. It's not a character, something mindless. It's just a threat. These are all things that fit in one category. But this SCP fits into many different categories because of the way it's presented. And as it goes through its stages in its cycle in the SCP Foundation, you can see it moving through each individual one. And I think that's pretty interesting, and it makes it worth talking about. And it has a lot of history with the SCP Foundation, and it has, it's going to be interesting to add it on to talks and discussions about other SCPs and what-if scenarios, which we might do soon, because we've talked about a few of these already, and we talked about a few doctors, so who knows what might happen. So what do you guys know about SCP-053?
Mask.
It's a trauma mask that possesses things and people.
Pretty much. That's really all I know about it.
Okay. So we'll go back to the beginning of the Foundation's history with it. It was first discovered in a crypt in Venice. Yeah, and that's pretty much all we know. There's very few details about this crypt or what led to it being discovered. All it says is it was found in a crypt in Venice. Deal with that information what you will. It looks like a white porcelain comedy mask that can change to tragedy. Every time it changes from one phase to the other, every depiction of SCP-053, whether that be a painting, a photograph, video, they will all change when the mask changes. So if the mask goes from happy to sad, all records of it being happy previously will also change to sad in real time.
What if you Photoshop an image?
It will still change.
Does it...
No loopholes.
Oh god.
Even artistic
Oh.
depictions, paintings change.
Honestly, compared to the rest of the SCP Foundation, that's actually pretty normal.
That's not all it does.
Well, yeah, but still.
Blah blah blah. It has a black corrosive ooze that's viscous, and it constantly flows from the eyes and mouth of SCP-053. This ooze is highly corrosive. Don't touch it. It's bad. It's stinky. The SCP Foundation did tests on this ooze, and basically whatever it covers, it will slowly start to corrode. Pretty much everything, depending on the material, the only real difference is how long it takes for it to corrode it. So they found that the thing that takes the longest for this ooze to corrode is glass. So now in present day SCP, they keep it in a glass box. But even that doesn't last forever. This black ooze is, as I said, highly corrosive. It's viscous. It's not good. You don't want to get it on you. It has a very low pH value, which means it's very acidic. Not good to, don't touch. It decays any of the blah blah, glass is closed. If you look into SCP-035's eyes, you have a strong urge to put it on. Or if you are within 2 meters to 1.5 meters of SCP-035, you will also get a very strong urge to put it on. This one was also in the SCP one-shot. I want to say the first one? Maybe the second?
I thought it was the second. You did, I think it was.
No, it was definitely the first one, because it was in the Foundation
yeah.
that was in a rectangle shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right.
And then everyone
was
succeeded their
like
fortitude except for good old Carl. We
Yeah,
need
we
to
really
talk
did
about
that.
Carl eventually. Maybe if there's time after this, we'll bring him up. But
Oh.
basically, if you put on SCP-035, its brainwaves overwrites the host's, which effectively, replaces the host consciousness with the consciousness of 035. Basically, brain dead host, and now it is, for all intents and purposes, 035. But 035 still emits the ooze that burns things, so if a host body degrades pretty quickly, but even past the point of, like, a body not being able to function anymore, 035 still keeps the body moving forward. So the structural, like, integrity of the body doesn't really matter to 035. 035 cannot possess animals and can only possess things with humanoid shape. That includes mannequins, that includes large dolls. Basically, if it looks humanoid, it can possess it.
Can it take over a zombie?
Yes.
Well, I mean, yeah, okay.
Because it's humanoid.
Yeah, and it only, like, it only can't do it. Never mind. I don't know what I was gonna say.
Having some problem there.
Yes.
Anywho, 035 has been a useful source of information gathering, and it claims to have been at many historical events throughout history. As well as the Foundation has also learned about other various SCPs through communication with SCP-053. So originally, when it first arrived at the Foundation, it was given hosts pretty frequently to gather information, to converse with SCP-053, and it was a pretty mutually beneficial interaction. Except, like, SCP-053 gets a host, but obviously it needs to stay in the facility because secure, contain, protect, and all that. But this started to go awry because of SCP-053's, well, let's just call it troublesome personality. SCP-053 is extremely charismatic and intelligent. but it is also incredibly manipulative to a point where you can't even like comprehend what the grasp this thing has on the human psyche. 035 claims to where is it? Claims to know the inner workings of the human mind and claims to be able to change anyone's mind depending on how much time he's given. So that's literally insane. Like, imagine someone who's like devotedly religious, or someone who's a hard, fast atheist who's never believed in God, and he can make them switch swap positions.
Yeesh.
He can convince anyone of anything given enough time. Wow. That much power is insane. He's also incredibly sadistic, and he's been known to, just through talking and verbal communication, drive people to suicide and convert other people he's talked to into basically his own puppets for him. Yeah. He can also, he has an innate telepathic ability to gather information to manipulate people. So he can't, like, telepathically control people, but he can look into someone's mind to find out information to further manipulate people. Does he need this information? Sometimes. Does he truly need it to manipulate people as well as he does? No. He is an intelligent creature that can do things even without its own abilities. There's a lot he can do with just the power of words, which I think is really interesting. But because of its behavior, and, well, let's just say it's also noted interest in SCP-4715 and 682, which 4715 is the Demon Born of War, which we talked about last week. So, pretty fucking scary. And SCP-682 is the Immortal Lizard. Two SCPs you really don't want this thing to be interested in. They're worried, even though, like, SCP-682 isn't exactly humanoid-shaped, but they're worried that if it does bond with one of them, that it would, like, because they have regenerative properties, it would find a permanent host for SCP-035.
Yeah, you don't want that.
Mm-hmm. You really don't want that. Something with that much intelligence controlling pretty much gods. Ugh. That's bound for disaster.
I wonder if the SCP could actually convince some of the old gods to stop what the heck they're doing. That would be terrifying.
This reminds me of an old god, honestly.
To me, it reminds me the most of Dr. Bright, an object that can only communicate while possessing others and has a consciousness that travels over and over again.
That's
linked
true.
to an object. I feel like this is a potential fate that Dr. Bright could fall into.
Yeah, which is sad, but inevitable.
It is inevitable. But 035 has made a few escape attempts afterwards. Has made a few escape attempts, basically manipulating staff to attempt to get it outside the facility. These escape attempts were fails. Pretty much they all failed. They came close, but you couldn't work out all the details, and when you have to rely on others, and you are just, a porcelain mask, there's not too much you can do. But he did his best, and he made it pretty far along. But after he made these escape attempts, his host privileges were revoked, which basically turned him from a character into an object with, no rights to speak, and was basically just placed in a cell. But some weird stuff began happening after its host privileges were terminated. The walls of its cell began to ooze the black substance, so not just from its eyes and mouth, but the walls itself began to ooze it, which compromised the structural integrity of its holding cell and caused other problems. And, you know, it's corrosive, so that's not good. And the ooze, this ooze, was a little bit different from one that came from the mask. This one was a mix of the black ooze and human blood. The ooze sometimes formed writing in patterns in the walls, basically like old Latin, Italian, English, like occultic symbols, so like pentagrams, upside down crosses, things like that. Even sometimes whole paragraphs explicitly mentioning like family members or people or loved ones of like the staff workers in that facility. So some real fucking creepy shit. So it was trying to reach out to communicate any way it could, and it was trying to prove that it needs its staff privileges back. But after staff privileges were revoked, many personnel like in the facility began to protest this change, and a few of them even erupted into violence, which prompted the SCP facility to terminate anyone who has had direct contact with SCP-035, because, well, when you're this manipulative, you don't know who you can trust anymore. So they decided to just terminate everyone who's had direct contact with it.
Honestly, kind of makes sense.
Yeah, especially with something this dangerous. I would say this is one SCP that is almost like it's a Keter class SCP. It's incredibly difficult to contain. All right. Blah, blah, blah. Where am I? Oh yeah. Once the ooze started coming from the walls of the cell, staff, when they were inside the cell, they complained that they could hear loud whisperings and high-pitched laughing at irregular intervals while inside the cells. And suicide rates also rose around the entire area around the cell. So, like, pretty much on that entire half of the facility, there were complaints of, well, bad shit happening. And, well, if your staff's committing suicide in this dangerous work environment, that's not good. So they decided to start coding the inside of the cell with another SCP called SCP-035, which I'm not too sure what it does, but basically it blocks out, like, mind-affecting stuff. So they made panels out of it and, like, lined the cell walls. And that basically made the suicide rates drop to pre-035 levels and calm things down for a little bit. But it did have an inverse effect, causing the inside of the cell to act almost like a greenhouse, like insulating all this bad fucking juju. So workers in the cell now, like, they didn't just hear loud whispering, they heard deafening whispering and laughter that was, like, almost too loud to, like, focus on. They began to have eye bleeds and nose bleeds, and if you were in the cell for more than 3 hours, you would fall into complete psychosis. The ooze only continued to get more and more until cleaning it up all the time. They had to do it almost every week, and they had to replace the panels in there almost every week. The ooze began to pool up so much, it would literally coat the walls and ceilings completely. Tendrils made out of the ooze would start to reach up at people, and they had like a pH of 2, so it was like hydrochloric acid on touch. So really fucking bad for people working in there. The door started to lock randomly, so people would go inside and they'd try to exit and then they couldn't. The lights in the cell ceased working. Cleaning almost became impossible for the cell. Oh, and the glass they had the actual mask in the middle of the cell, it would just randomly explode, sending shards of glass and the black ooze everywhere around the room. It's highly, like, it's written as if SCP-035 could control this, and he was doing it on purpose in order to, like, you know, cause as much fucking trouble as possible. So he would only really explode the glass when people were in the cell. So a lot of people were dying just to try to keep this thing contained.
Well then.
Dang.
Need to see it.
And then eventually they had to just shut down the old cell and move it to a completely new one. and they just like locked up that part of the facility.
I mean, it makes sense. Jesus Christ, this thing is causing way more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
It
too,
is
but
kind of-
like, what do you do with it?
Yeah,
Like-
that's very true.
It's like it's their job to contain it. It's not like they can just release it. It's not like they could store it in a different way. Like it would still affect everyone around it.
That's very true. It's very tough because at the same time, like I understand why they do not want this thing to be possessing people because having that much power for any given amount, like even people in regular history are very a lot of dictators and a lot of terrible people are just very very persuasive, and because they're very persuasive they got to the amount of status they were. So imagine if there was just, but at least to that they tried to manipulate like they were manipulating the situation, the grievances and struggles of people. So yes, they were dangerous, but outside of that, if you were really thinking rationally and if you were in a stable position, you could say no, you're crazy. But like this SCP, it doesn't matter what state of mind you're in, it just manipulates anything. So I understand why they don't want to give it possessive privileges.
And
Although
the thing that's the most impressive about it is like manipulation is not its anomalous property. That's just something it just innately knows how to do. Sure, it
Right.
can manipulate someone to
That's
put
not-
on the
yeah.
mask, but after that point, it doesn't manipulate people to do anything else but that. It uses its words and actual persuasive nature and charisma and intelligence in order to manipulate more people. And, bro, when you look like a scary fucking mask and you can manipulate people to that degree, that's incredibly impressive.
right, and the
I
and the
need you to
fact of
kill
the
this
matter,
person. Okay.
No, and then you just convince them. It's like, I guess that would make logical sense.
Yep.
even though it makes no logical sense.
Well, it would, because he would explain it in a way that would make perfect logical sense to the way, for the way of the person he's explaining it to.
Oh, that's even more terrifying. Just imagine if you were able to logically explain literally anything.
That's pretty much what it does.
Oh my gosh.
He manipulates people not just like, not physically, but with just his words and convincing people. That's how he does it. Which makes him incredibly dangerous. If he wasn't so fucking creepy, he would probably be like a world nation leader.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't
It's
be
kinda hard to
surprised if he
hide
was
that.
throughout history.
Well, crap.
Literally getting some of the most experienced professionals in the world for dealing with SCPs on your side as an SCP, to get them to a point where they'd fight for you, die for you, and even try to break you out of the one thing that they need to do. Like, that's some serious power.
Although I wonder, I'm pretty sure that with that being said though, he could actually stop some of the more violent SCPs, because like think about like stuff like the Scarlet King. Like if you could convince people that like the Scarlet King is not a real thing and it's just like an illusion. Well, no, that's probably not how the Scarlet King works. Because I think
Yeah,
just
but
by knowing about him, it powers him up.
yes. But yeah, I see
But
what you mean. Like with the old gods and how like their things like this guy like it works through conversation and it takes time to convince someone of something they don't believe. But which basically is the hardest thing to do. But he could have definitely be used to convince anyone of anything. So if you could harness that to convince people like to make them completely forget like the Scarlet King exists, or completely forget about violence, or creating world peace. The problem is it's only one mask, and you can only convince one person at a time. So who do you convince to change that belief? There's only so much you can do while talking to one person at a time. And that's completely disregarding the fact that SCP-035 has a complete intelligence of its own. So as you're sitting there saying, hey, I need you to convince this person of something else, during that conversation with 035, he's going to convince you that he doesn't need to do that. So it's literally impossible to use him as a tool because of how manipulative he is.
Yeah, but imagine like this. So like last episode, I believe we talked about how like there are certain because of how the old gods are, they don't really apply by the regular laws of physics, and they have to and rituals because people believe in them that they work. You know, they just work. That's usually how it is. So imagine if like for sake of argument that the possessive mask was actually helpful for a second. Let's just all he would really have to do for that freaking deer is just say, "Hey, there's a ritual out there that works better and is less cost effective, and all you really have to do is make something up and then people would believe it and it would actually work." That's terrifying.
I would say that's probably something he can do. Like, he could definitely, like, because if you convince someone who has authority or power, like a history professor or an O5 council member, that there's an even better ritual that could contain, like, an SCP even better, and then that person of authority completely believes that because of the convincing, and then he gives that information to the Foundation or to the people doing this ritual, people believing that, and it's not just that people believe the ritual will work, it's also the repetition of the ritual happening. So those two things on top of each other, he could definitely be more than he is. I just don't think he has the desire to do that, because he has a very sadistic nature, and that really holds him back from half of the stuff he could accomplish. Working with the SCP Foundation, he could control the entirety of the world. But I just don't think that's what he wants. Like, he's been alive for most of human history. He's probably held that position before, and it probably bores him. The one thing he probably hates more than everything he's done previously is being locked up as an object, which is why he's being so rebellious and trying to get his host privileges back, because he finds entertainment torturing people and trying to get stuff out of them. He could have escaped a long time ago as soon as the SCP Foundation found him, but he probably saw a new opportunity and figured it'd be interesting. What's a good example? What's a character who just does stuff to just try to think it's interesting and stimulate him? Kind of like Goku trying to fight new people. He just sees an opportunity and is like, this might be something. But yeah, he goes from a character, and then he gets locked up as an object, and then he basically becomes a monster, like completely turning his cell into almost his own domain. Unable to communicate, but still able to lash out.
Yeah, makes sense.
So for story writing purposes, it makes him incredibly valuable, because you can use him as either three. You can use him as a MacGuffin, an actual character, an antagonist, a monster you have to run away from. It's a plethora of options for you to use. I think there's plenty of stories that involve SCP-035. I love how similar he is to Dr. Bright in almost every way. They're both like objects linked with linked consciousnesses that transfer from host to host. The only difference is SCP-053 has, well, more hazardous anomalous properties.
That's true.
And convincing capabilities.
I would say Dr. Bright is pretty convincing as well.
That's true.
Yeah, let's be real. There's an entire wing of things that Dr. Bright isn't allowed to do simply because he convinced somebody that he's allowed. Simply
that he
the first time.
You cut out there, buddy.
Screw it.
Okay.
I ran out of breath.
Well, yeah, Dr. Bright isn't as manipulative, but he has done stuff like that in the past. And I think they both live their lives as a way to seek more stimulus for continued existence, trying to just find anything to do.
That's true.
There's
I mean,
a
if you
really
live
funny
that long,
story. There's an SCP which is
Oh.
literally just a tinfoil hat, and it just blocks out like psychic powers and stuff. And they had a D class walk into his cell with it, and then he just went to a frowny face, and then he just sulked all day because he was defeated by a tinfoil hat.
What?
Yeah,
What do you mean?
because he was trying to read the person's mind, and the dude was just sitting there like, "Yeah, I have no compulsory effect to put this mask on," and then he was just like,
Oh.
"Oh, big sad."
I'm dead.
But yeah, I think SCP-035 is pretty interesting. He's definitely one of the more basic ones, and he's one of the oldest SCPs. He's like literally like 35, like. But I do think he's really he's well written, like at like what he is. But I think he has more potential as an object in other stories.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of potential there. It's just I don't recall seeing it that often in the SCP videos that I've watched or the articles that I've read. But I could just be missing some obvious ones or forgetting something. Plus, I'm not a big fan of the fan-made stories.
It's not really an SCP that gets brought up too often, even though I think it has a lot of potential, but it's just not but apparently it's just not as popular as like the Immortal Lizard or as we have graciously called it, Peanut.
Yeah.
It's just not as popular, which is a real shame because
it's up there
didn't know
though.
a lot of yeah, it's up there, but it's not as popular as those two, I guess.
That's true. And of course, like, you don't have the internet potential that, you know, the furry ones have where you can fan art the hell out of it.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, but you know exactly what I mean.
I wish I didn't.
So, Turn Up, what do you think of 053? What the hell am I saying? 035.
Oh, it's cool.
You want to elaborate a little bit more than that?
Yeah, sorry. I don't like this thing existing. I think if I was to, I don't know, figure out a way to deal with this, it'd have to be somehow transporting it to another dimension where it can't harm us.
Yeah, but what if it finds something in the other dimension to put itself on?
Well, how is it gonna get back?
Who knows? But do you want to take that risk?
Well, throw it into a dimension where it doesn't have the capability to get back somehow. I don't know.
Well, that's the thing in SCP. Basically, everything's pretty much a black box. The SCP organization only understands so much about what it has in its possession and what's outside of its possession. Basically, anything that's an unknown variable, they don't really want to risk that. They'll test it, but they won't risk it. Like, let's say you took SCP-035 and you made a concrete box and you dug it deep, like let's say 10 miles deep in the ground, and you just left it alone. Now it has no people, it can ooze it as much as it wants, it's going to be stuck underground. What's it going to do? What if you have another organization like the Serpent's Hand or the Children of the Scarlet King, and they have an SCP in their possession that knows of 035 and can find it. And now you have 035 in contact with Occult that it can use. And 035 remembers that the SCP organization just buried it in a fucking hole for it to rot. Or you think it's going to be happy?
Or even worse, you have idiots like the Global Occult Coalition who try to destroy it and end up messing everything up because that's usually what they do.
Yeah. That's
Because
why the SCP organization always prefers to have things under wraps and protect it themselves and let unknown variables in. They try to contain as much as possible. They try to hold everything in its lab, do what little tests they can to keep themselves more safe, to understand it more, and maybe use it to stop other SCPs. And that way they can have a nuke on site or whatever precautions they need on site in order to keep everything there protected.
Yeah, because like at first when you think about it, it's just like, why on earth does the SCP organization secure, pertain, and protect? But then there are some stories where they talk about the Global Occult Coalition, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, okay. Because there was one, and only one that I remember, that was just so dumb that I just couldn't believe that these people actually existed in this world. So I'm not going to spoil it because we might do it in the future, but basically it boiled down to the Global Occult Coalition helping a freaking person complete a ritual so they could kill a god. And just imagine how
Classic.
messed up that ended up. You can imagine how bad that ended up for them. Like, they actually summoned a freaking god to try and kill it. Needless to say, that didn't work. Oh, just idiots.
Dr. Clef used to be part of the Global Occult Coalition.
Oh.
And
that
Clef,
makes a lot of sense.
Clef fucked the god, so
Yeah.
that actually makes a lot of sense now that you say it out loud.
But yeah,
they're idiots.
Well, I feel like the SCP organization makes its fair share of mistakes as well. And there are ways to like counter SCPs with other SCPs, such as like the tinfoil hat and such. So maybe eventually, like you can't use the tinfoil hat against this thing if it's possessing a host, because its manipulation is not an anomalous property. It simply is just that convincing. Which is sometimes what's more terrifying of something having a property you can't understand is something having a property you can understand but can't do anything about. Anywho, I think that's a solid place to leave it off for this week. Yeah, I know this was a shorter one. It's only about 40 minutes, but we'll come back next week. Leave a like on the video and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. We'll try to make this weekly in case stuff happens, but next week there will definitely be another video, probably a little bit longer. Yeah, and I think this was a solid choice for today, and yeah, I think that's about it. So we'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one. Goodbye.